From the City of Angels off the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, manipulating the weather with Stephen Quayle. Well, another one in from bin Laden. Al-Qaeda chief Osama bin Laden called on Europeans to simply stop helping the Americans in the war in Afghanistan, saying America is ebbing in excerpts of a new audio tape aired on Al Jazeera television. Bin Laden said that he was the only one responsible for the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, arguing that it was unjust for the Americans to have invaded Afghanistan. The message appeared to be a new attempt by bin Laden to influence public opinion in the West. In 2004, he offered Europeans a truce if they simply stopped attacking Muslims, then later spoke of a truce with the United States. In both cases, Al-Qaeda later denounced the countries for not accepting its offer. In California, Rodney King, whose 1991 beating by Los Angeles police led to deadly rioting the next year, was shot on a street corner, but his wounds were not life-threatening. 42-year-old King was hit in the face, arms, back, and torso by birdshot fired from a shotgun. He was shot possibly 2 or 3 times from a distance. Now, this is for all of us who work late. Working the graveyard shift will soon be listed as a probable cause for cancer. I kid you not. It's a surprising step validating a concept once considered wacky, and it is based on research that finds higher rates of breast and prostate cancer among women and men whose workday starts after dark. Next month, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the cancer arm of the World Health Organization, will now add overnight work shifts as a probable carcinogen. Sad news out of Seattle. The voice of Larry Nelson, a longtime talk show host there, who retired in 1997, has been silenced. Larry Nelson, a great guy, dead at the age of 70. He lost his battle with lung cancer. In Jacksonville, Florida, a 14-year-old Florida student was facing third-degree battery charges after throwing a crayon at his teacher. He was kicked out of the school. His mother said the punishment was too harsh. He's a model student. A strong earthquake rocking eastern Caribbean, sending office workers in Martinique all over the place. 7.4 magnitude earthquake there. A Russian woman gave birth by the light of dozens of mobile phones after a power cut plunged the town that she was in into darkness. Emergency generators eventually kicked on to help her, but everybody had to hold their mobile phones by her so they could give her enough light. By the way, if you get up to the coasttocoastam.com website, take a look at the Digicam icon, which is listed there near the feature article. You'll see my little grandchild, Gavin, and 7 pounds, 6 ounces, but there he is, if you want to take a look at him. In a moment, Linda Moulton Howe joins us with an incredible story about an eyewitness who saw the military put a security ring around a low-hovering, glowing disc in Albuquerque in 1974. Okay, here she is, Linda Moulton Howe, Emmy Award-winning television producer, investigative reporter, and you know she goes right to the heart of the story to get some of the answers, and she's got another incredible one here for us. Hey, Linda, how are you?
Oh, George, hi, and happy holidays. This really is an amazing story, and what I'm going to share tonight goes back about 11 months ago with an email that I received in January 2007 from an Albuquerque resident named Paul McKeever. He said that he and his family had seen a glowing disc first in the sky and then on the ground surrounded by military, and he really had my attention. So I gave his phone number a call, and by March 4th of this year, I met with Paul at the apartment where his Aunt Sandy Rivers lived with her family in the early 1970s, and where Paul, at age 8, was visiting with his mother, Rebecca McKeever Armstrong, and he and his 2 cousins were playing outside when the 3 saw a bright, glowing white disc moving in the evening sky at the same time that their mothers heard radio station 770 KKOB announce a news alert that an unidentified flying object was in the air over Albuquerque. and the mother and aunt came running out. They got in a car. They chased down Albuquerque streets as they watched this glowing white disk move slowly and steadily downward in the sky toward the Sandia Hills. And what they saw has haunted them for the past 33 years. And what still puzzles them, and now me, is how could something so seemingly public to at least a few curious Albuquerque residents be so completely erased from media and public discussion afterward? And before we hear from the family tell their own story, I would like to let you and Coast listeners know that right now at my news website, www.earthfiles.com, there is a very big report about this glowing disk encounter with military in Albuquerque.
Okay.
It has maps, photos, drawings by the eyewitnesses, and documents. And there is even a 1974 Newsweek magazine article about all of the animal mutilations and mysterious discs that were being reported in May 1974 and throughout that entire year. Newsweek said, quote, since May 1974, more than 100 cattle have been found dead and gruesomely mutilated in Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. When a veterinarian examined the corpse of one mutilated cow, he found that all of the animal's blood had been drained, and at least one farmer claims that a shiny UFO landed in a field where a slaughtered animal was later found, unquote. And, of course, I have reported for years about the link between the discs, the non-humans, and the animal mutilation.
Sure have, Linda.
And those shiny, glowing discs, George, were being seen around the world in 1974, and some reports were even about disc retrievals with or without non-human entities that year. And one such event has received a very brief historic notation. The French website, ufology.net, states, quote, UFO crash in New Mexico, May 17th, 1974, in Chillicothe. A U.S. Air Force team allegedly removed a 60-foot wide metallic object from an impact area and moved it to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, unquote. Well, then I learned that only 1.5 weeks later, on May 28th, 1974, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, known as NICAP, received reports from Albuquerque residents that on that morning, a large, very bright, glowing object was seen moving across the western side of the Sandia Mountains. An eyewitness opened his window to listen for noise, but there was none, and that glowing object landed on a nearby hill in the Sandias where, quote, it remained for over an hour before it shot into the air and vanished, unquote. And then after that, a housewife in the same Sandia Hills region reported a 50 to 75-foot diameter object that, quote, displayed a distinct whirling motion as it rotated around its central axis, unquote. And that sighting lasted a minute. Well, that was the morning to midday on May 28, 1974. Research now suggests that by 9 p.m. on May 28th, more Albuquerque residents were watching a large glowing white disk moving from the south of Albuquerque and Kirtland Air Force Base to the northeast. The disk moved very slowly and steadily downward toward the lower Sandia Hills at the eastern edge of the city. And over at the Arroyo del Oso apartments at Pennsylvania and Montgomery, 8-year-old Paul McKeever was outside on the warm evening playing with his two cousins, Lisa, age 10, and Larry, age 4. The kids saw this large glowing football-shaped object in the sky, and they ran to the apartment yelling for their parents to come out, and the parents, Rebecca and Sandy, were already coming outside because they both heard a 770 KKOB radio announcement that an unidentified flying object was over Albuquerque. We went back to that apartment to begin our interview.
I just remember that they said an unidentified flying object has been seen over Albuquerque, and then we talked a couple of minutes about whether we should go see we could find it or not, and that's when we got up and got to the door and the kids were coming in.
And we came out to get the kids to take them, and we could see the glow from it.
Like looking at a football sideways. It had a really intense glow, like a fluorescent bulb, or like those globes that have like a bulb inside of them that's white, and it had a real intense glow to it, and it was moving kind of towards us to the left is what I remember. We got in the car, and that's when we drove and were chasing it down, trying to see where it was going.
He and the other two children were outside playing, so they actually saw it before we did because we heard the announcement on the radio.
We more or less followed the glow. We went out Pennsylvania, and when we got to Manal, it looked like it was up at the end of Manal.
On April 1st, 2007, I traveled with Paul McKeever, his mom and aunt, out Pennsylvania and Manal beyond Tramway Boulevard, as far as we could go after 33 years of housing development spreading at the base of the Sandias in what were only dirt trails back in 1974. The family thought one particular rock-covered hill looked like the place they drove to following the glowing disc in the sky.
And we came up as far as we could on the pavement, and then it was like I guess you'd call it almost like a dirt trail that we took. It wasn't really a dirt road. It was like car tracks make through a field or something. We drove onto that, and we could see an object with a lot of light around it, bright light, and we were stopped. We were told we had to turn around and to leave the area. Immediately.
Yeah. And he was very agitated.
And he was, he meant what he said.
Yeah, he was very, very serious. We were fairly close to the object, close enough to get a really good look at it and to see the people around it.
Yeah, soldiers.
And there were soldiers around it, and they had it like a perimeter around it. And every so many feet, there was a soldier dotted around the thing.
They were armed.
Yep,
yeah,
they had M16s.
M16s.
And they were facing the object. And the thing was glowing intensely. The funny thing to me was that it was at the very bottom slope of the hill, but the thing was pretty level. But you couldn't really see anything underneath it. It was just kind of sitting level. But it looked like it was close enough to the ground to be on it, but it was level. That baffled me.
Because it was on a more or less a rocky surface.
Yeah.
It may have been hovering there?
That's what I would think now, thinking back, that's exactly what it was. It was hovering.
Because there's no, you couldn't see any
nothing-
gear or legs or
No,
anything.
couldn't see anything under it.
And it was glowing, so it was illuminating the area around it. Plus, they had the deuce-and-a-half truck, which is a 2.5-ton truck that has a canvas back on it, but the canvas was off of it, and they had a spotlight mounted on the back. And they were searching the bushes and the area and the rocks outside and around of the object. It looked like they're trying to see if anything was like hiding in the bushes or around the rocks, because they had soldiers around it, but the soldiers were back. They were, away from the thing. They weren't like close to it. They were back away from it. To the right of the object, from our point of view to the right, there was a whole pool of vehicles, and there was more personnel mixed in amongst the vehicles. From what I noticed, they're all military personnel. The only person that wasn't military was the guy who stopped us at the end of the road. From what I remember was that he had a state patrol uniform on, and I remember the car being a state police car because it was black and white, and the state trooper cars were black and white. The whole time this thing was glowing, he just made us turn around. We turned around and pretty much left the area. That was it. We just left.
There were other cars parked behind us that were coming up
the road, yeah.
the road also. And I'd say there was 5 or 6 at least behind us.
Yeah.
That I remember.
Military. They were here before us, which means that they had to be following the object the whole time, because
there wasn't that much time.
There wasn't that much time, yeah, between when we saw it and went after it and it was on the ground. It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that.
Seems like it. And it seems like I remember seeing other military vehicles driving into the area.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, too.
I mean, there were a lot of people there, but there were some more coming in. And it was all the military.
From that hill, we're real close to how far we were that night.
Yeah.
For this kind of thing, we were very close.
Very close, yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot closer than you would think you could get to something like that. Nowadays, I don't know if...
we could have gotten in that close before we were stopped.
We were very close.
Yeah, because they only had one guy turning traffic around, the state trooper.
Yeah.
And you're looking at a disc. Mm-hmm. It's about 40 feet in diameter.
Yeah, approximately 40 feet, judging by what I remember how big the soldiers looked to the thing. I remember it being about 40 feet in diameter, maybe 10, 12 feet, somewhere in there, tall.
So for that disc to be looking totally flat and horizontal to you, how would you explain that if there is a slanted hill?
I don't know. That's the question, you know. I don't know what...
It was either hovering or...
glowing, so it must have been under some kind of power to hold it there, you know, in a level position, because you couldn't see anything
under it.
Protruded out
to help it, stand,
sit there,
whatever.
Because it was lighting up the whole area, so you could see ground underneath it and around it, and then plus the spotlight was shining around, and so it was very strange to me that it was level on the side of a hill.
Yeah, very strange.
What a story.
Yeah, and there's more to come. Paul and his mom and aunt have more to say in the next half hour, but I wanted to try to give a context here for what might have been happening in Albuquerque on May 28th all day long.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, a decade before the Sandia Hills event, back on April 25th, 1964, there was supposed to have been a prearranged meeting between extraterrestrial biological entities known as EBANs and American military at Holloman Air Force Base near White Sands Missile Range south of Albuquerque. During that alleged alien and human meeting, 3 football or egg-shaped white craft, just like what Paul McKeever and his mom and aunt are describing, hovered in a defensive triangular pattern close to the ground. I have been told that the non-humans gave military representatives some advanced technologies and agreed to take 3 of our military to their planet in an exchange program, while 2 or 3 of the EBANs remained on Earth as, quote, visitors, unquote, at Los Alamos Laboratory and other sites. Now, this exchange program is perhaps what President Ronald Reagan was referring to when he told Close Encounters film director Steven Spielberg that the scene with people going aboard the big mothership was, quote, close to historic reality, unquote. Now, it's possible that in May 1974, that the brightly glowing disk that seemed to hover horizontally on that rocky Sandia hillside was, for the whole day, from morning to night, was hanging around the Sandia Hills, and it may have been that it was some sort of communication going on with some agency or unit at Kirtland Air Force Base, and that is why so much military got to the site so rapidly before Paul's family and the other cars. And I am hoping tonight that someone listening was also there in May 1974 on that Sandia dirt trail watching the glowing disc surrounded by military, or was one of the military people. And if so, please email me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. As Paul McKeever and his family said to me, quote, "We all deserve to know the truth about the discs, and if enough witnesses speak up, maybe they can make a difference, even if it's 33 years later." And coming up in the next half hour, we'll hear more from the family and what other disc activity was going on around Albuquerque, New Mexico, and those mountains.
And Linda, right after the break, what we'll do is we'll have you wrap up with the second part of this story, and then we'll have time to take a few phone calls. You want to do that this hour?
Oh, yes, I was going to give some more historic data, but I would be happy to do that.
Yeah, we'll have time for all that. So stick with us. Linda Moulton Howe, earthfiles.com. That's her website. And if you need to email me, well, that's just George at coasttocoastam.com. So we'll be right back. We'll get part 2 of Linda's investigation of still another bizarre, incredible story. And then a little bit later on this half hour, we'll just have 10 minutes or so for your phone calls with her on Coast to Coast AM. Stephen Quayle joins us next hour as we talk about weather manipulation. But let's go back to Linda Moulton Howe now and get her to wrap up this part of the story before we take phone calls with her. Go ahead, Linda.
Okay, the scene is that Paul, his mom, and aunt, and I are up on the Sandia Hills, standing as close as they thought that they were to where this glowing disc in the military were back in 1974. And we are talking about what in the world could have been going on, that this disc is hovering there horizontally on a hill that has a definitely slanted slope and a lot of rocks on it, and it could not have landed, and it definitely was not a crash. And we pick up now with Paul, who is not certain that it was a prearranged meeting, but that none of them have an answer.
The way the soldiers were around it with the spotlight and everything, it wasn't something that I think that they were expecting, you know. But to me, it looked like maybe it was disabled or was caused to be disabled. I don't know.
They had a reason, the military, for being there so quickly.
It was a group put together in case something like that happened. Because it was just like, how do you get stuff, all that equipment, all those people ready so quick?
And it was like they were standing there guarding it, like they were waiting for someone or something to come out of it.
Yeah.
Or to someone to come and tell them what to do.
Well, you could definitely tell that they were cautious of it. You know, when I was in the Army, when you guarded something, you faced away from it. So they weren't guarding it like it was ours. They were around it like they were keeping it contained almost, you know. Because if it was ours, the guards would have been facing away from it.
How do you think that they kept this totally bottled up all these years?
You know, I'm sure the government, if they wanted to keep it quiet, they probably went to the TV, radio, and newspaper and told them to keep it quiet, because there was nothing on the news, there was nothing in the newspaper or on the radio the next day or even several days after. It was just like it never happened.
Like it never happened.
As to why the people, though, that were there, like us, and the people that were in their cars, I don't know why no one ever said anything. We didn't. I don't know.
I don't know if they were contacted and told not to, or if they just thought people thought they were crazy, or...
But we were definitely intimidated, because we didn't ask what's going on. After he told us to leave, we immediately turned the car around and went straight home.
And when he told us to turn around and the way he was acting, I remember it scared me when I was a kid.
And he said it in a very authoritative voice.
Yeah.
Like there was no point in asking any questions because we weren't going to get any answers.
Yeah, because he was very, very stern about it and irritated and nervous.
Did he aim a gun at you?
No, he didn't. No.
And what made you decide in 2007 to contact me?
I was just curious. I wanted to know if other people were on the web reporting the same event that we saw. So I started contacting and asking questions to see if I could get other people that had witnessed the event.
And Sandy and Rebecca, you were young adults then. Have you ever talked about this with other people to find out if they saw it?
No. Just
strangely
with the
enough,
family,
we haven't.
Just
No.
family, but I've never told anyone except family.
Do you have any idea why?
No, I don't.
No, I've thought
because
about it, and I don't know why.
Yeah, I
never
just
mentioned it.
And we didn't talk that much about it, even with family.
Do you think that it was that you were literally so scared?
I think
We
it just...
did tell family, but I
Well,
don't.
it's hard to talk about something like that without... You don't want people to think that
people to think you're
that
crazy,
you're crazy or
ridicule
that
you or something.
you
But
know, that you're weird or something. But over the years, it's gotten to the point to where I just didn't really care.
Well, that's good. Go ahead, Linda. Wrap this up.
Well, now Paul, his mom, and I searched the Albuquerque Journal microfilm, And we searched for an entire 12-month period from May 1973 to May 1974 to look for any events that would be like this. And believe it or not, on page C20 in the Daily Record, on what date? May 29th, 1974, the next day, there was a blockout card in the lower half of page C20. But I went to get this photographed, wondering what in the world, and then as I kept going through the microfilm, I realized that right after the blockout on the bottom half of C20, the very next 3 pages in the microfilm were identical copies of page C20 without the blocking card. So I went to the librarian and I asked why there was a blocking card on one page followed by 3 perfectly readable pages. He had no explanation, and he seemed puzzled himself. And it raised a question in my mind. Is it possible that an agent of the American government under orders went to the Albuquerque Journal publisher and said, in the interest of national security, we need you to change page C20 of your May 29th, 1974 issue that might have had some blurb about this, what was going on in the Sandia Hills? I know that in my own research of contacting libraries all over the state of New Mexico looking for specific newspapers and specific dates in the 1940s, that I've had librarians tell me that the entire state seems to have had selective removal of certain dates that none of the libraries have. And it's this idea of being able to sanitize events like this and keep it covered up, both through intimidation and by some kind of erasure, that this is a very, very important story, and there is a whole lot more that was happening around that time. But since we're going to try to take some phone calls yet tonight, what I'd like to say is that hopefully some Coast listeners tonight here in Albuquerque, or were here in Albuquerque back in May 1974, and they might know more about this disc encounter with the military in the Sandia Hills. And if so, I hope you would be willing to email me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com or to call in tonight. And next week on Friday, December 7th, I'll have a follow-up to this government secrecy and yet another alleged government secret, a clandestine American astronaut corps and space program. And then we're going to have the whole second hour for phone calls, and I hope I can learn more from Coast feedback. So, George, this is a very, very important story with very solid people. And I'm grateful we've been able to get this much out, and maybe somebody listening will have some information tonight.
And maybe more. Stay with us. We'll take your phone calls next with Linda Moulton Howe. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie with Linda Moulton Howe. And you know, Linda, it's one thing to have people, eyewitnesses, see a glowing disc. It's another thing to see military people surround it.
Right, and that they had a light all, and that they had jeeps, and the military was there, and they were driving from Montgomery and Pennsylvania, Montgomery. It's only about 20 minutes from that corner up to the Sandia Hills, and that means that the military was already assembling there when that was in the air.
Let's take some calls. First-time caller line, you're up with Linda. Hi there.
Hi, this is Jim from Cape Girardeau, Missouri.
You know it well. My son went to school there, and you had years ago one incredible apparent UFO crash out that way, Jim.
Yes, sir. I learned about. I'm sorry. Yeah, I learned about that when I first moved up here. It was really interesting. I've talked to a few people that remember that time, and it was really strange. There was a preacher here in town. It was one of the first called out there. They thought it was a plane crash, and they wanted him to go give the last rites to dying people. And I talked to his daughter, who still lives here, and it was really amazing, the things that she remembered from back then.
You've got to get her phone number and get it to us, Linda. Here's another person you'd probably love to interview.
Absolutely. I would love to talk with her. If you can get the phone number to George or email me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. I would love to talk with her.
Yes, ma'am. I will see if I can do that. If I can remember, because this has been about 6 years ago. But I believe she's still here in town.
Okay.
And I will do that. And Mr. Norrie, I'll get that to you. And Ms. Howe, I do have your website, so I can email that to you.
Great.
My question is, in the late 80s, I heard about an exchange program.
Right.
That was going on. And you had referenced that I hate to say aliens, were being held captive.
Well, they called them extraterrestrial biological entities, and others call them aliens. So,
Project Serpo, though, Linda, right?
Yeah. Well, the Serpo may be some intel test.
True.
But what I heard back in the early 80s were 3 people went from Holloman Air Force Base in an exchange program that began April 25th, 1964 at Holloman. And I know others who have that same date and have that same information. It's quite different from Serpo. That isn't to say that there might have been another exchange. That is what the Serpo material is about. There may have been many or several. And that's where we need honesty. We need truth from this government about exactly what the DISC technology is, who is in all of these aerial craft, what does our government know, and why do they think that we all should be kept in the dark? And that's why I'm appealing to anybody listening who may have information about Albuquerque, May 1974, or any other encounter between military and discs. That is especially important because all of my research indicates that our government has had some kind of, I'm going to say, communication, both in conflict and meetings with non-humans for a very long time, whether they admit it or not.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Jim. And see if you can get that information to us. East of the Rockies. You're on with us. Hi there.
George?
Yes, it sure is.
My name is Tony.
Hey, Tony, and where might you be?
I am just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay, Tony. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Listen, this, I've not really, I've told people in passing and friends and so forth, but back in October of 1973, we lived in Milford, Ohio, which is just outside of Cincinnati. I was 8 years old at the time. My sister is 5 years younger than me, so she doesn't really remember. But my father, my mother were in the car. We were coming home late on a Sunday night from my grandmother's who lived just west of that. We saw coming down Old Indian Hill Road a huge bright light up in the sky. And about 12 blocks further, we get to an intersection, and this large, very large, cigar-shaped object was about 200 feet above the treetops and flew right over the intersection. Now, the thing is, it was moving very slow. There were 3 or 4 other cars at the intersection. And then we lived in Milford. When we got home, our next-door neighbors was actually a police officer for Milford.
Mm-hmm.
His wife came running up to the car and was hysterical. Did you see it? Did you see it?
Another witness.
Yes. It had flown at the end of our street, and they witnessed it also before it got to the intersection and so forth. Now, the thing is, evidently that same night, police officers in Owensville, Ohio, which is further east of Milford, also got reports and witnessed it over the school. And in another county, in West Union, Ohio, just Adams County, a couple of counties over from Claremont there, police officers also witnessed it going over an intersection there. And somebody actually, I found it on a website that somebody put together about this rash of UFO sightings in 1973 in the Cincinnati area. So those are actually like Cincinnati Enquirer paper reports and all of this.
Linda, have you heard of anything like this?
Yeah, 73 was an active year, not as active as 74, which just took a huge spike around the world. But what I'm interested in, was there any big story and play on radio, television, and your newspapers in that area after all of these people saw this low-flying aerial craft?
Any media there, Tony, afterwards?
Just about a year or so ago, I thought I would try to find something on what happened that night, if there was any reports. And like I said, somebody actually gathered a bunch of these reports from the Cincinnati Enquirer newspapers and so forth. There was, I was 8 years old at the time. So there evidently was media reports and everything, because this was evidently there were a number of reports over a period of about a week within this area.
So it could have been a little flap there, Linda.
Well, yes, it was going on. There was no question. 73, 74, 75, 76, they were all really intense years. But 74 in Albuquerque, what impresses me is that this occurred, and somehow the media and the public, there was a complete erasure of the event. And here are people who admit that they sat on this story up close and personal for 33 years. And they never told anybody until they talked to me this year.
Okay, thanks, Tony. We have time for maybe one or two more calls. West of the Rockies, you're on with Linda. Hi there.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
This is Dennis from the Seattle-Tacoma area.
Yeah, sure thing.
You just mentioned flap, and so I was wondering if Linda knows why there are flaps. I remember the Lorenzens of APRO several years ago believed it had to do with the close approach of Mars.
That's a good question. Why the waves?
Well,
Linda?
It is a good question. I guess now, after all of the education that I've had so far, even though I can't prove, I do feel that there have been waves of retaliation and attack going on between our government and this phenomenon. And that when there is a flare-up of some of the activity, I think it's because there are standoffs and conflicts. And there is a huge body now of emerging evidence that our government, for a period of time, was trying to attack this technology, and apparently payback was quite painful. And then we stopped trying to aggressively attack them the way we were trying with missiles and artillery. And today, in my mind, is the question, what are we doing in 2007? And that relates to next Friday's Coast, in which I will be on for 2 hours with a fascinating new set of research data about the fact that there may have been a secret military space program since at least the end of the 1950s in parallel with the public civilian NASA, and that it may have been provoked largely because of the interaction of non-human intelligences on this planet that our government is still trying to keep under lock and key.
You know, Linda, Richard C. Hoagland has been saying for years, too, that there's a secret military program out there. And for a long time, it fell on deaf ears. You know what? I think he's right.
Oh, it goes back. I'm going to share on Friday an amazing story from the New York Times. Richard Sauter, a very good researcher, investigator, and author, found this New York Times article from August 7th, 1989, about the secret astronaut corps in the military. And I will share more about that, plus a whole lot of surprises about the background of Neil Armstrong and a whole huge, gigantic link to another Middle Eastern space program. And all of this comes back to what was going on in Albuquerque in 1974. Well, out in Coyote Canyon, which is what I was going to talk about, but I'm glad we've had the phone calls, we were storing, and probably are to this day, storing nukes inside of the Manzano Mountains at Coyote Canyon, where UFOs were landing.
Next week, Linda. Well, they say in Missouri, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute. It'll change. Well, it's been changing all around this planet pretty rapidly. But why is it being manipulated? Tonight, our special guest is Stephen Quayle, and he's next on Coast to Coast AM. Stephen Quayle, author, journalist, broadcaster. He's articulated the need for Americans to be aware of bioterrorism and weapons of mass destruction. He is an expert when it comes to genetics and giants. And tonight, we're talking about weather manipulation with Stephen Quayle. Hey, Stephen, it's a good time to have you back. Hi.
Well, hi, George, and thank you for inviting me back on. If ever there was a time that we have a subject matter that's affecting everyone's life and will affect us in the future, I think in very detrimental ways, this is it. You know, there's a real sense that the climate system is complicated enough, and that if you start messing around with it, you're likely to get an outcome you didn't expect. Now, that's a statement that one of MIT's leading ocean geochemists said, Edward Boyle, and I think the idea that weather modification now is so apparent throughout the world, it's just a startling reality that there's enough stuff. You can go in weather warfare, weather modification, Google it, search for it on Yahoo, and you're going to be surprised that there are literally millions and millions of references to weather modification.
Well, and there's no doubt, Stephen, that we know that governments are playing with it, practicing with it. Some of them are very verbal about it, saying, hey, don't worry, we're going to have an event, but it's not going to rain because we're going to take care of the weather. They just come right out and say that now.
Well, they do, and if you look at some of the Weather Air Force documents that have been released and pulled off the internet. Fortunately, people have made copies of them, and I produce them all and reproduce them all in my book. The thing that's fascinating is that everything that we're talking about, whether it's hurricane generation, steering tornadoes, generating areas of at just intense rainfall in other areas, keeping a standing front from producing any rain, i.e. like what's going on in the southeastern United States, we've got the whole basis now laid out for weather warfare. Zygmunt Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor under Jimmy Carter, basically said that weather warfare becomes secret warfare, where one nation can make war on another nation and blame it just on the environment. And that's what's going on. I believe, like Scott Stevens has said, George, that all weather now is manipulated. The days of natural, predictable weather are being totally distorted, destroyed. And I can tell you that the billions and billions of dollars that have gone into weather warfare, weather modification, all the different treaties from the United Nations treaties, the Operation Popeye, where we first started using it in North Vietnam on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, actually with 2,400 missions to cause it to rain. We have a history of manipulating the weather. We have a history of manipulating the ionosphere. And as we get into the technology, as we go through the show tonight, it's not just HAARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Project that Nick Bagich has written about. It's the intense taking off from even that of the manipulation of the entire climatological model of the Earth. I came up with a statement, and Amsel Rothschild made a statement once about banking. He said, give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who writes its laws. I think the governments of the world are saying, give me control of the world's weather, and I care not what the weapons in their armies do. So the point is that this is one of the most intense fields of manipulation, study, and funding that's out there. And there's no longer what I would call the syrupy denials. It's in our face. We're seeing the results. We're seeing hurricanes being steered. We're seeing hurricanes being actually generated and brought over the same geographical coordinates, i.e. in Florida. We're seeing typhoons. We're seeing counter-rotation. We're seeing every form of abnormal weather that you can imagine.
Stephen, let's go back really to almost the beginning of time. Was there weather manipulation then?
Well, I actually believe there was, from the standpoint that it's my contention, as you know, George, the times we've spoken on your show, that the ancients had technology that is absolutely incredible and phenomenal. And it's also my contention that the armies of the world are vying for that ancient technology, and that they're the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys want to keep the potential destruction away from the bad guys, and there are people who absolutely are not going to be content until I believe they've destroyed 9/10 of the world's population.
You think that's the whole motive for all of this?
I do. You know, it's fascinating because the Illuminati, the Luciferians, the entire global elite has this a really egalitarian attitude that everybody should basically be off the planet but them. The United Nations, which sounds all cordially warm and fuzzy, has got some pretty dastardly plans, and I would tell you quite candidly that the whole idea of weather modification is you can control populations, i.e. you control the weather, you can control the growing season, you can control, obviously, areas that are if you want to take over an area, you can drive people out just simply because there's no water, there's no rainfall, and then you can bring back, quote, the normal weather or steer rainfall into that area, and basically you've just acquired a lot of real estate very, very inexpensively.
Now, tell me if the weather modification started off in a humanitarian way.
Yeah, initially it did. The U.S. military, even back in 1947, came up with a project called Project Cirrus, where they dumped about 160 pounds worth of dry ice into a hurricane. The bottom line was they were trying to dissipate the hurricane, but unfortunately it caused feedback, like my opening statement in quoting the ocean geochemist, is that when you start messing around with the weather, you're likely to get an outcome you didn't even expect. And through Operation Cirrus, Project Cirrus, they had such flooding in Atlanta, Georgia, even people lost their lives, that they had to cover up that whole operation and kind of make it go away. Now, that was in 1947. Then we had, and I just want to give the timeline because I think it's important for people to find this. Project 119L was U.S. Air Force trying to literally figure out all the different weather patterns of the world, and what they did was kind of a fascinating thing, which we'll get to when we talk about what's going on in the Arctic, is that under Project 119L, it was recommended that basically they drop a lamp black in the atmosphere, and they literally thought that that would absorb the heat and could direct the energy inherent in any storm. They later settled for silver nitrate. And then we get into, 1966, which I mentioned, Project Popeye. That was a cloud seeding on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which, by the way, was incredibly top secret until Jack Anderson saw something referring to it in a Senate appropriations bill and brought it forth. Then in 1977, we had an environmental modification technique treaty called NMOD. 2002, the Weather Damage Modification Program. And I think what most people have got to understand, and this is what I'm trying to get across, is that the absolute paper trail leading up to the development of weather modification and the initial purpose versus now what is almost all for warfare is so detailed. In 2005, Senate Bill 517, which was authored by Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas, said it was called the Weather Modification Research and Technology Transfer Authorization Act. Now, when you start getting treaties, and you start getting appropriations, and you start getting all this stuff that's out there, it's reasonable to assume that you don't have treaties if the technology doesn't exist and doesn't have a potential to not only hopefully be able to do good. See, I maintain that they could use it for good, but obviously they're not, because the order out of chaos, ordo at chaos, is the order of the day, literally, and that's to cause the old world to flee away and this new, what I would call, technologically decadent utopia to come into being. And when we talk about genetic engineering, when you and I first started talking about that, this relates to weather modification. When you and I first started talking about that, there was just a few stories now and then.
That's right.
Dolly the sheep. Now, George, you can't pick up any major scientific publication, or it doesn't matter if it's the Financial Times, the British newspapers, India Times, Hindu Times, Pravda. Everybody's talking about mixing animal and human DNA. And now we're even getting into the thing that you and I discussed years ago, which was the super soldiers. In other words, the biological attenuation of a human being with, if you will, super increased properties where basically you don't need to eat. You've got the strength of 100 men, and basically it's the bionic woman or bionic man on steroids, and that's where we're all coming to now. How weather affects that is the same electromagnetic energy that HAARP, the extreme low frequency that the Russian woodpecker, a lot of people remember. I'm sure you remember that in the 70s, going into the 80s. The point is that it drove people that were listening to shortwave almost crazy, and it turned out to be that was Russia's over-the-horizon radar. But what's fascinating is I've gotten, just in the last 2 or 3 days, several emails from hams, shortwave radio operators, saying that it seems that it's coming back. You know, the tension between the United States and Russia.
Oh, it's growing again.
It's ratcheting up. You're a Navy man, you saw the story about the Chinese submarine popping up in the middle of one of the U.S. Navy's major exercises undetected. And so now we've got the whole world of electronic measures, countermeasures. We've got weather control. We've got the propensity now to use these things, all these different technologies. And I would say this, a total hellfest or a hellstorm. Military has another word for it, but we'll just use hellstorm. And the point is that we're now in a place where it's so perilous because as Atlanta, let's just take Atlanta. We've got Atlanta now, I think, with about, 40 days of water because Lake Lanier.
Yeah, it's drying up. So why don't they let it rain over Atlanta, Stephen?
Well, the question is, who's keeping it from raining over Atlanta? If you take the whole eastern seaboard from the Carolinas, North Carolina has got a phenomenal drought going on.
We try to keep fighting it by doing our mind consciousness experiments, but we're fighting some science here.
Well, I think you're fighting not only science, but I think you're fighting supernatural principalities, powers, demonic entities that most people absolutely cannot grasp the warfare that's going on in the unseen realm. You know, here's the thing. Think, and I mean this, you can think good thoughts, but when you're dealing with technology that basically is harnessing some of the most intense energy transformers in the world, whether it's HARP or whether it's any of the ionospheric heaters. Look, the United States exploded nuclear weapons in the ionosphere to set up our own Van Allen radiation belt, so to speak, to test it called Project Argus. And so we've manipulated everything we can manipulate, and I believe that global warming is happening. I just do not believe that it's because of SUVs and cows belching. If people could even understand the amount of energy. Now, here's something that'll blow your mind. Do you know that the United States and Russia have had a long-standing treaty to basically melt the Arctic ice cap?
Yep.
Nope. But see, this is something that's fascinating. This really got me going, George, because under two different projects, I mean, this stuff started in 1971 with the Polar Expedition of the Global Atmospheric Research Program called POLEX, P-O-L-E-X. And then how does this sound? The Arctic Ice Dynamic Joint Experiment, or AIDJEX.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that there's a lot of collusion going on because it was, I think, one of the Council on Foreign Relations spokesman, even back in the 50s, a guy by the name of Conable, that made the statement that the great treasure trove of the Arctic could be ours if we were to figure out, I'm paraphrasing, how to melt the ice. So I maintain, and what most people don't understand is that it's going on right now because obviously it shortens the sea passage, but if you've seen now Russia and the United States vying, and Canada, over who owns the Arctic, it's getting very, very heated. And I think this all plays into our topic tonight, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. We're, by the way, great title, okay?
You
great
like that?
Title. Yeah, I just said, I was telling Tom, I said, that is a great title. Because now, I know you had on Pat Buchanan.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the conclusions that are being drawn are absolutely inescapable. And when you take into the whole context of consideration and what this all means to you, our kids, our grandkids, our whole heritage, it becomes very, very, very dangerous, and it's troubling.
Stephen, why would someone want to control the weather? What are the possibilities?
Well, the control, first of all, that's the key word, okay? It's the same thing. Why do people want to control the finances? Why do people want to control this, that, or the other thing? I've talked to some fairly wealthy people, and they've told me that they said when you get a certain point of money or get to a certain point of money, whether it's, they set their own threshold, whether it's $1 billion, $10 billion, whatever. The point is it's not about the money anymore. It's about the power. I think Ted Turner was on record as making the statement once that making money and the power that comes along with it was better than sex. Those are his words. So the point is, George, is that people want to control ultimately the weather, first of all, because they can control the population. You can basically make war on selective groups of people. This is what the military, their whole position was, and if you look at weather as a force multiplier, you can go on the internet and type that in and come up. And by the way, we set a bunch of links up on my website I think you guys have linked to me.
Yes,
but on the Coast to Coast, what I've tried to do is present multiple articles. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff that people just are going to say, I can't believe that, or in some cases are going to say, I do believe that, and it's more sinister. But I want to share this, and this is the hardest thing to grasp. The ultimate point of weather modification is for warfare and for the destruction of targeted individuals and groups of people, whether it's the Chinese and us, whether it's us doing our targeting. You know, we see, and with weather modification, the same technology that's present for weather modification, George, can set off volcanoes, can set off earthquakes. The Russians have been developing tectonic weapons, so have we. Bernard Eastland's patent, which Nick Begich brought out in a big way in his book, Angels Don't Play This Harp. There are 12 open-source patents that deal with everything you and I are talking about right now. And some of the greatest earthquakes in history, the one that happened in Tangshan, China in 1976, where 655,000 people died. I don't know if you remember this, but when that happened, the Chinese were blaming the Russians in those days. Those were tectonic plate weapons. Even after the Cold War, some of the Russian scientists that defected said, we generated that quake.
And here's another thing that convinces me, Stephen, that something just isn't right here, and that is heavy-duty hurricane forecasters have been so wrong over the last several years, it's absolutely almost unbelievable. And I'm sure they're shaking their head. Somebody's playing around, and they obviously can't predict that.
They can't predict it because their models are based on premises that are no longer valid.
And they're based on real Earth changes in science.
Absolutely. But when you supersede the real Earth changes in science and you introduce a whole new catalyst in the equation, you get a whole new set of responses. And I think that that's the thing that's most amazing. You know, we're hearing of the rogue waves happening all over the world. We're hearing of freak waves. We're hearing of intense sea level rise, and this is even sea level rise that cannot be accounted for, just even glacial melt, snow melt, and the melting of the Arctic and the Antarctic, etc. And it is my contention, George, that when the Banda Sea quake went off and the whole situation down there, there was a 750-mile-long rift, as you probably are aware, 60 miles wide. It's my contention that literally the fountains of the deep are being broken up. And today, as you know, the earthquake that is being reported, the 7.4 in the Caribbean.
Caribbean, sure.
What's fascinating to me, listen to this. This blew my mind. There are 11 deep sea ocean trenches that are the deepest places in the ocean. The Marianas Trench in the Philippines, obviously, but most people don't realize the Puerto Rican Trench and the Cayman Trench are very, very deep, 25, 27,000 feet. And a group of scientists a number of years ago said, look, we're seeing something that's not explainable. And they're saying, we're going to see some huge quakes on these trenches. Now, I'll tell you an interesting thing. When I said it's supernatural, the abyss, the depths, the deep, deep water, the deepest places in the earth, historically has been the place that, quote, rebellious fallen angels have been chained in the oceans.
All right.
And that's a fascinating thing. So we've got listen, in Genesis 7:11, we've got about the narrative of the deeps being opened, or the great deep being opened. That word can translate abyss. And the fascinating thing is we've got 11 trenches that appear to be opening.
Stay with us as we talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That encompasses everything with Stephen Quayle. And our special guest tonight, Stephen Quayle. Could this be the beginning of the apocalypse? More to come on Coast to Coast AM. Stephen, when did you begin to start thinking about this weather manipulation possibility?
Well, I've always been a student of climate and history, and the fascinating thing is that I think this is something that's overlooked by so many different people. It's just the effect that climate has and where people ended up settling. If it was hostile, obviously they had to move. We know that Greenland was called Greenland because the Vikings used to farm it until things got tough and they had to move. But I think the fascinating thing is that it's not just what happens to the climate necessarily. It's what happens to the entire culture as it responds to the climate and the climatological effect. So to answer your question, I've been at this for about 25 years. Now, I'm especially happy with the way this book turned out, Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters, because, again, George, no one's ever put it, and I got to tell you, people have talked about, there are great books out there on weather and the weather modification, but especially when we deal with things like chemtrails, when you deal with, you put it all together, you put the treaties into perspective, you put the experiments into perspective, and you ask me the ultimate question, which I bring it, I think, and I lay it out so clearly. This is the most concise answer to what's really going on. Who's behind the scenes? What's going to happen? Look, there's a reason why we've got the Ultimate Surveillance Society being thrown and thrust at us daily. You know, now I'm sure you've seen the news article. Now they want to put basically hovercraft in the sky and be able to taser people with hovercrafts. Did you see that story?
Yes, I did. It was as weird as they come.
It is weird. Now, see, there is a method to the madness. The point is that we're seeing, if you will, the absolute Orwellian nightmare unfold before our eyes. I know that Pat Buchanan has come to the same conclusion that so many of us are. Some of the smartest people in the world, I'm talking people recognized by their peers, are saying, this is it. You know, it's one thing to wishfully think that the world will go on and change and be nice. But when you've got this power madness, and I believe the power madness is supernatural, as you and I have talked at length over the so many shows we've done, there is an element that goes beyond description. And when you can't describe it in physical terms, you can go into the spiritual realm. And I believe, as you know, that the Bible sets a stage. You said the apocalypse. The word means the unfolding of the end-time events. So, you know, it used to be people would smirk and laugh at the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They'd call me a doomsdayer. You know, they'd say all this stuff. But then they started to realize, hey, I no longer have a job. Hey, my food costs 30% more. Hey, I can't afford health insurance. All these social issues are absolutely affecting the lifestyle and, I would say, the ultimate time period that people are going to be living on planet Earth because of the attempt, and I say that, the attempt that's underway to destroy. And again, I don't think that people understand what I'm saying when I say, listen, there are people that want they want 9 out of 10 people dead. They believe that they are going to form this utopian Orwellian society where people will get to live forever. They'll get to basically download their entire essence, if you will, into a new cloned body and perpetuate their desires, their appetites, and their quest for knowledge. You've had Ray Kurzweil and a lot of the transhumanist guys on your show. So the point is that they believe it's a good thing, but beyond the ramification of everybody wants to live longer, nobody wants to have cancer, all that stuff, there is a more sinister thing going on, and that being the systematic destruction, in my opinion, of humanity, and an insertion, if you will, of a technological/demonic composite. Now, that's a mouthful, a technological demonic composite. It's kind of like interesting. We've talked about the ancient pharaohs and their embalming techniques and the canoptic jars where all of their internal organs were taken out of their bodies, placed in the jars, which were buried with the sarcophaguses, etc. But it's fascinating, George, because now, you know, just in the last 10 years, people are talking about bringing back extinct species, bringing back extinct people, and literally, or dead people through their DNA. And now we've got a situation where the knowledge base is accelerating at such a horrific speed that literally it's hard to keep up with all this stuff. And it's not only hard to keep up with it, but to draw the conclusions of where it all leads. And that's, I guess, what I believe my calling in life is, to say, look, one thing leads to another, and this is what it's all leading to. And that's what Alex Jones has done in his videos, saying, look, this is what's been happening, but this is what it's leading to. Pat Buchanan's latest book, this is what's happened, this is what it's leading to. It's almost like there is a suicidal death wish for everything that made us great, And now, and let me share this, there is, in my opinion, no political answer to this. You know, you can't just vote out one band of thieves for another. The thing is, you need a quantum change, but the powers that be have decided America's going down. Let me just put something into, I think, financial perspective.
Sure.
Because if you take a look at what's happened, just since the last time I was on the radio with you, is that now we've got a crisis in what are called the derivatives, which are structured investment vehicles. Let me explain that to make it really easy for people to understand. Debt was bundled, all forms of debt, whether it was mortgage debt, whether it was commercial debt, credit card debt, and it was sold to multiple people down the line. But let me put it into a perspective I think people understand. Get a pile of horse manure, put it in a pretty box, take that pretty box and wrap a pretty ribbon, and each time you sell it to the next guy adds something to the box, never opens up the box, and then the third guy ends up putting little bells and whistles on the pretty bow. The fourth guy adds some chocolates. The fifth guy adds a beautiful tray that presents a box. And finally, when we come to a point where that box has to be opened, everybody looks at it and says, it's horse manure. And you know, that's the easiest way I know. You can take the most complicated quantum financial, economic, econometric model and boil it down to horse manure. Because without a market for all of the, you know, here's a number, George. You and I are this is flabbergasting. $516 trillion. Okay, that's what they admit to. Those are derivatives. That means that's a financial entry on their books that has no value. Okay, they can mark to a, which means they can evaluate it or value it to a hypothetical computer value. But when somebody's got to cash that hypothetical computer value in and they want real dollars, there's no one to give them real dollars. So I don't even begin to touch the surface of how deep this is. We've seen Citibank bailed out with $6.5 billion by Abu Dhabi. We've got the situation now, and this breaks my heart, where we're seeing the piecemealing of this country. In other words, the United States is going to the highest bidder. And now I think it's fascinating that you're seeing the death of the middle class. It breaks my heart.
Rapidly, too.
Excuse me?
It's happening rapidly.
Rapidly. And let me share this. I got a bit of information I think is so profound. Some of the bond traders, these guys are the who's who in the world, are speaking out behind the scenes carefully. Do you know how many people they're estimating are going to lose their homes next year when all the subprime and the adjustable rate mortgages reset? Do you know what they're factoring in?
What's
6 million.
Jeez.
Now, that's staggering, because when you look at 1929 through 33, the Great Depression, now you say, how does all this fit in with weather modification? Simply this, that when the weather changes, let's just take, I think the best example is Atlanta. People go to their toilet to flush. There's no water. People go to their kitchen sink or whatever sink, bathroom sink. There's no water. That can be let's say mediated by bringing in bottles of water, cases of water for a certain time. But there comes a point when people just have to leave because there's not enough water. Take that into effect where places like North Carolina now, they have to import their hay to feed their livestock. All the meat, if you will, all the livestock now is being slaughtered because the farmers can no longer, and the livestock raisers can no longer, ranchers can no longer afford to feed their animals. So now you've got a glut of all this animal protein on the market, but guess what? There is nothing in the stream behind it. So I can tell you this, weather modification is the ideal weapon to not only, change the location of people or herd, them into a place where they can be better contained, but it also is the ultimate way of generating famine, which generates death. And that's the point. Weather modification can generate massive drought, which results in massive famine, which results in massive death.
Are they testing this first in other places?
Yes, absolutely. Africa has unfortunately been the test tube of the world. It doesn't matter if it's Ebola, it doesn't matter if it's AIDS, it doesn't matter if it's the weather modification. As you know, most hurricanes form off of the western coast of Africa in what's called the Sahel region, S-A-H-E-L. And the point is that there's massive electromagnetic signatures going on, that there's some real nasty technological equipment there. And as everyone probably has heard this in the past, the Sahara used to be a lush area, and now it's the world's, one of the largest deserts.
Of course, yeah, but that happened millions of years ago.
Not millions, George. That's what you're told in the normal course of events. See, this is what makes me crazy about what I would call, how should I say this delicately, the assumptive lying devils, the ALDs, okay? That's very cordial. The point is that, like we're seeing in the Arctic, let's just say this. If you understood that you could take lamp black, you could take carbon, you could take ashes, throw them out on the snow, the sun heats those ashes up, and as the ashes heat up, they melt through different layers of the snow, and then you say, that's pretty simple. But then you wonder exactly what the end game is, and again, if you're putting in billions of watts of energy, and you're scattering microwave energy and every other form of energy across the poles, then you could see that it's getting pretty active. Now kick in another dimension. It's like getting a bucket full of water and dumping in a brick. Obviously, you dump in enough bricks in the water, it's going to raise the volume of water in the pail. Well, the same thing happens when you generate earthquakes or you initiate volcanoes or you start everything rolling. And I've got to tell you, in my book, and I've got to share this, when I started doing the research on this, how I typically would research, over 15 years I'd have multiple file cabinets, and I'm not a guy that puts everything on the computer. I put hardly anything on the computer, but I got files and files and files. Then I take those and I basically look at the historic audit trail of when this stuff first started getting mentioned, okay, and in what context. And as you carry it forth, it's flabbergasting. I can share this. It will literally take your breath away as to what these individuals have. Now, take in the have planned for us. Take in the supernatural element. I believe they are absolutely trying to, how should I say this, terraform the earth. And I say terrorform the earth, okay, T-E-R-R-O-R.
Not with the A.
Not with the A. And they're getting ready for something to come back or something to be released that needs a different atmosphere. They're killing us. Listen, chemtrails, the most amazing and astonishing thing to me is that people will not do their homework on chemtrails. Cliff Carnicom, there are so many people out there that have done a great job on this, They've written extensively. I remember first starting to talk about this 15 years ago. And again, with Dr. Teller, who was a former head of Majestic, the top secret, if you will, alien control group, what they originally, were planning to, quote, deflect the sun's rays back into the upper atmosphere, et cetera, then all these other groups got involved with testing out different biological agents. I have a dear friend named Linda, who's a former microbiologist, who I'm telling you, when you take photomicrographs of this stuff, it's not tough to figure out the stuff, meaning the chemtrail residue. These are not contrails. Listen, there are absolute protocols for flying across the United States. Flying east to west, different altitude than flying west to east. When these guys are playing tic-tac-toe with the what I'd call death spray, the point is that somebody's got to take notice. So when I hear some, and I would say this, paid hack from one of the intelligence agencies or the State Department or anything, well, they're just contrails. Contrails, yeah, like conning. In other words, the bottom line is they are not contrails. These are weapon dispersal activities taking on biological. I mean, barium. Barium is on the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency's material safety data sheet as being poisonous. And you've got all these other things going on. And now I linked to it for your listeners to go and look at. But even the Germans are upset now, and there are some German citizens that have filed a suit against the German government because they're monitoring the chemtrail spraying going on, and this is becoming a big deal. We are being terror-formed. We are being literally, I would say, presented with different biological and chemical toxins. And God forbid, when those biological chemical toxins are exposed to certain waveforms of electromagnetic radiation, they can take on a toxicity and a lethal, if you will, effect that is so deadly. Look, we've got so many people with respiratory diseases. We've got so many outbreaks of everything. GDP just believes the nonsense. Now, not everybody believes it, but the mainstream won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, and I'll tell you why. Because they're vomit brokers. They only regurgitate what the higher-ups tell them to, and they'll never deal with reality. And thank God for talk radio.
Weather wars and unnatural disasters. The unnatural disasters part of that scares me. The weather wars, I can understand that if they fight. Unnatural disasters sounds like it's out of control now, Stephen.
Well, it is, because, again, this is a powerful, powerful statement. This was made by a guy named Keith Harmon, and I love the statement. It's one of my favorite statements. He says the disparity between public perceptions and military realities is monumental. Now, let me tell you about Cumbre Vieja, okay, because this is real time. Cumbre Vieja is the infamous volcano that's in the Canary Islands on Tenerife, and if it should slide into the ocean, that's where you get the 500-foot wave, if you will, tsunami, that's going to hit the East Coast. I can tell you this, George, from military sources, there is a battle going on, because one of the things in this weather warfare presentation of the Air Force is knowing how to exploit specific geological weaknesses. Does that maybe give you a heads up?
Yes, sure does.
And the point is that, I mean, it was no secret that during the Cold War, the Russians planted, obviously, different nuclear weapons, even in Yellowstone Park, even in Mammoth Lakes, California. There were different areas that the exploitation now, due to the bravery of men and women without equal, those things were basically, I'm telling you, we have some incredibly marvelous, wonderful people that will lay their lives down and do, and you never hear about them, I never hear about them, but they lay their lives down so that others may live. But I got to share this with you. The bottom line is that this drive, this ambition to destroy is becoming so piranha-like. In other words, it's eating everything up around it that I don't really think that even those who think that they're going to have basically this perpetual prosperity in their giant park and they won't have any useless eaters around, I don't think they understand what even the people that are selling them that set of bill of goods have prepared for them.
This is all tied into the apocalypse, Stephen. Next hour, let's take some time and talk about that, okay?
Absolutely.
Where do you get the book, Weather Wars?
Well, you can get it. You can get it off my website, stevequayle.com, or they can call, and please don't call. As you know, I only sell my books through my website, but they can call 719-547-9100, 719-547-9100. And I got to tell you, George, the people I've gotten the first 100 out, I just got these, in the last week from the printer.
Sure.
But it is. I got to tell you, it's the most amazing thing that I have ever seen put together because it ties it all together, and it's got to. People have got to understand this affects everything, and well, actually affects everything, not only now but in their future. And if they don't understand this, I'm telling you, the future is very bleak.
As we talk, Prophecy next with Stephen Quayle. And we're with Stephen Quayle tonight, his newest book, Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters. And how does this all tie into the apocalypse? Prophecy. Stephen's next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, and of course, Stephen Quayle. Stephen, you have studied prophecy. You've studied Genesis. Tell me just a little bit about the four horsemen, about the apocalypse. Old Bill Cooper, who died in 2001 in a gun battle with police, believed that in his book, Behold the Pale Horse, all these horrors would come. You're almost like the new evolution of some of the things he believed.
Well, I don't think I'm the new evolution. I'd say I'm a concurrent voice with his. Bill Cooper was so ahead of his time, but remember, William Cooper, who he was and the information he had, just in the time I've been listening to the station break, there are people emailing me saying, well, how do we know this is not science fiction, etc.? Well, first of all, the prophetic realm of this, George, is so clear. One of the things I think in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is based on the book of Revelation and Revelation chapter 6, you basically have the different horses being the different judgments coming upon the earth, and the judgments are coming upon the earth at the same time this individual called the Antichrist, who takes the place of Jesus Christ, is being revealed to the world. Now, we're dealing with a fascinating situation here. We've got war, we've got famine, we've got death and hell, We've got absolute chaos. And I think one of the most prophetic and profound things that got me, if you were to ask me what's the most prophetic thing that has gotten you, it's this whole idea of that we're coming into not only a cashless, but a totally manipulated society where everything we think, do, and say is basically not only in the pill they gave us today, as the old song used to say, but in the plans for us. And Revelation 13, 16 through 17